They thought they were dealing with a navy that just patrols and sends angry press releases. What they actually met was a destroyer that speaks in course lines and closest point of approach numbers. In November of 2025, a 70,000-ton Russian tanker named Seahorse slipped out of Matanzas, Cuba, fresh off delivering a cargo of Russian naphtha, a light petroleum liquid often used to dilute Venezuela's heavy crude, and headed south. On paper, it was just another commercial voyage. In reality, the ship was on almost every sanctions watch list in the Atlantic. It had changed names, swapped flags, and picked up a reputation as part of Russia's shadow fleet, the tankers that keep sanctioned oil and fuel moving when the law says it shouldn't be. Its destination was Venezuela, but waiting between them and their ultimate destination was the USS Stockdale, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer with a very simple mission: make that trip as hard and as risky as possible without firing a single shot. To understand why this one tanker mattered so much, you have to look at the wider strategic context. Washington has spent years trying to choke off hard currency flowing into Nicolas Maduro's regime. That meant sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company, pressure on buyers, and a stealth war at sea against the networks that move fuel and diluents into the country. Russia, Iran, and others responded with a shadow shipping network. Ships with long histories, questionable ownership, sometimes unreliable maintenance, and a knack for creative routing started hauling naphtha and crude through legal gray zones. What made the system even harder to police was the mix of countries willing to participate in it. Iran had already built its own version of a sanctions-resistant fleet, a network of tankers that operated with irregular AIS transmissions, shell company ownership, and carefully timed rendezvous at sea. Many of those same techniques migrated into the Russian playbook once heavier sanctions hit. Some ships behaved like ghosts, drifting through choke points with intermittent signals or misleading port declarations that kept regulators guessing. China entered the picture too, though with a different approach. Its smaller trading houses and independent refiners were often willing to buy discounted barrels, no questions asked, as long as the paperwork arriving with the cargo created just enough distance from the original supplier. Together, these players formed a loose ecosystem of tankers that operated outside the norms most commercial carriers follow. None of this happened in the shadows by accident. Each country had its reasons and its own political calculus, and every loophole they exploited made it even harder for Washington to pressure Venezuela using traditional tools alone. That is why a single tanker like Seahorse drew so much attention. It had cycled through multiple names and flags, was under EU and UK sanctions, and had already been flagged by non-government watchdogs for Iran-Venezuela trade. On AIS, the automatic identification system that broadcasts ship positions, it looked like a tired 21-year-old tanker. On a US targeting slide, however, it looked like leverage. One more factor shaped what happened next. The USS Stockdale was not out there by accident. The destroyer had arrived in the Caribbean under U.S. Southern Command as part of an expanded counter-narcotics deployment, which also gave Washington a way to pressure sanctions-busting shipping on routes usually left to cutters and patrol craft. An Arleigh Burke with Aegis radar, helicopters, and a full suite of communications gear is overkill for chasing drug go-fasts. But it is perfect for sending subtle messages to ships like the Seahorse. After a short run south, the tanker cleared Cuba and pointed its bow toward the Venezuelan coast. But somewhere in that space, the U.S. destroyer slid into place and began setting the tone for the rest of the encounter. From outside the situation, it appeared almost ordinary. There were no confrontations, were flashy maneuvers, just two ships working their way through a busy lane. But the screens told a completely different story. AIS signals, satellite passes, and radar sweeps showed Seahorse making its run south while Stockdale shifted into a crossing course. What began as two separate tracks gradually tightened into something far more deliberate. As the Seahorse approached the edge of Venezuelan waters, its course suddenly bent away. The tanker executed a large-scale turn and headed back toward the north, then northwest. It did not slow down to anchor, and it did not push through toward the oil terminal. The only obvious variable in that picture was the destroyer's track, which had shifted into the tanker's projected path. This is how this tactic plays out at sea. A ship like Stockdale doesn't need to crowd another vessel to send a message. Holding steady in the tanker's path, plainly visible on sensors and by sight, accomplishes the same thing. If the bridge crews speak, the tone stays professional. Call signs confirmed, identities checked, and a measured hint that this voyage has drawn U.S. attention. For the Russian captain and whoever actually controls the ship's commercial decisions, that matters. A sanctioned tanker is already radioactive in the insurance market, and add a U.S. destroyer taking a special interest, and the risk climbs. So Seahorse turned away. A few days later, it tried again. The tanker's AIS signal once more showed it edging south, heading north of Aruba, angling toward the Venezuelan coast. Stockdale had not left the region. Again, the destroyer shifted into the path ahead, and again the tanker eased off and turned away. Before the week was out, Seahorse made a third attempt to reach Venezuela. And for the third time, AIS logs told the same story: an approach, a turn, and a retreat. By then, analysts monitoring the movement were already using phrases like cat and mouse and shadow blockade. On the screens, it looked as if a single American destroyer had effectively kept a sanctioned Russian tanker out of Venezuelan ports without ever laying a finger on it. Each failed approach also expands the intelligence picture. Analysts can compare Seahorse's track with other sanctioned tankers, match their dates and positions with port calls, and identify which companies or flags show up again and again. So the next time a similar ship appears off West Africa, in the Eastern Mediterranean, or near other sanctions hotspots, they already know what to do. For international allies watching, these details matter. Partners in the Caribbean and Latin America follow these movements closely. European regulators track them too. And when they see a U.S. destroyer use presence, maneuver, and documentation rather than force, it gives them a model they can refer to later. It also shows everyone involved that Washington is willing to put serious hardware in front of sanctions problems instead of leaving them to the financial regulators. This is where international law determines the limits. A blockade is an act of war under international law. It requires declarations, clear rules, and usually a coalition ready to enforce it on more than one ship. None of that applied in this situation. Stockdale operated strictly in international waters, and there's no public indication of warning shots, boarding teams, or forced interdiction. Southern Command has not shared its exact rules of engagement, but experts agree this fell well short of anything resemble a former blockade. So what do you call it? You call it pressure applied through positioning rather than force. You call it strategy. A destroyer like Stockdale can do a lot more than look intimidating. It carries helicopters that can range out, identify a ship visually, photograph hull markings, and check for AIS discrepancies. Its Combat Information Center can fuse commercial tracking data, classified feeds, and partner intel. That produces a detailed picture not just of one tanker, but of the network of ships around it. Stopping Seahorse outright would have triggered a cascade of legal headaches. The tanker is sanctioned by the EU and the UK, but not by the US Treasury. There is no UN embargo on Russia-Venezuelan fuel shipments. So interdicting it physically in international waters with no weapons involved and no immediate self-defense scenario would hand Moscow and Caracas a propaganda gift and open Washington to accusations of unlawful interference with freedom of navigation. Just spooking it is different. By forcing repeated course reversals, the destroyer made the voyage longer, more expensive, and far more visible. Each attempted run south burned more fuel, added more delay, and created a clear trail of AIS tracks analysts could study. Every attempt also revealed which ships adjusted course around the tanker, which ones drifted nearby, and whether any smaller vessels shadowed its movement. Operationally, Seahorse became much more valuable for what it revealed than where it wanted to go. Each time the captain pushed south and saw a gray hull waiting, someone in Moscow, Caracas, or an insurance office made a phone call. Those conversations are not public, but the map shows the result. Hesitation, loops, and days lost in the Caribbean. And yet, despite the delays, the tanker eventually made its run. Around November 23rd, after weeks of maneuvering and loitering, Seahorse finally crossed the line. Tracking data shows it entering Venezuelan waters and heading for an oil terminal on the northeastern coast, with maritime outlets pointing to ports like Puerto Jose and Puerto La Cruz. So, did the U.S. Navy fail? That depends on what you think the mission really was. If the job description is physically prevent any Russian fuel from reaching Venezuela under any circumstances, then yes, the tanker's arrival is a tactical loss. But navies do not work in scoreboards. They operate under political guidance, legal constraints, and long-term strategic goals. In this case, the goals included making sanctions harder to evade, raising the cost of every sanctioned cargo, gathering intelligence on shadow fleet operations, and signaling to both partners and adversaries that Washington is willing to put real hardware on the water to enforce its policies short of war. On those metrics, Seahorse became a very useful example. First, it exposed how a shadow fleet ship behaves under pressure. The AIS tracks tell a story that insurers, port authorities, and foreign regulators can read. Multiple aborted approaches, proximity to a U.S. warship, and a final successful run after days at sea all feed into risk models. That can drive higher insurance premiums or outright refusal to cover certain hulls, which hits the business model that keeps these tankers running. Second, it demonstrated a powerful template. One destroyer, backed by a wider U.S. presence in the Caribbean, used maneuvering, tracking, and visibility to shape a commercial decision. That is a play that other navies and coast guards can study. It avoids any form of escalation, stays within the lines of international law, and still imposes hard-to-ignore friction on sanction-busting routes. Third, it sent a signal to more than just Russia and Venezuela. China, Iran, and other players watching the Caribbean now know that even a single Arleigh-Burke-class destroyer can complicate a voyage for weeks without firing a missile. For the crew aboard Stockdale, the rhythm of the mission unfolds in long, deliberate stretches of routine that look deceptively quiet from the outside. On the bridge and inside the Combat Information Center, or the CIC, the work revolves around patience, precision, and constant verification. Watch teams rotate through the consoles, maintaining tracks on surface contacts spread across dozens of miles. Each symbol on the display has a speed, a heading, a last known position, and a projected one. And every few minutes, those numbers shift enough to require a fresh calculation. Radar operators refine the surface picture, while intelligence specialists pull in updates from classified feeds that never make it onto public tracking sites. Navigation teams run closest point of approach numbers over and over, adjusting them based on wind, current, and what other ships in the area are doing. Helicopter crews stand ready in case a closer look becomes necessary, and their role is built into the plan hours before they ever touch the flight deck. Inside the CIC, it merely feels like a series of the usual problem-solving loops. A contact shifts 10 degrees to port, and someone updates the maneuvering board. Another ship increases speed by 2 knots, and the next watchstander recalculates the time until its track intersects Stockdale's. At regular intervals, the team compares everything against coal rigs, the rulebook for preventing collisions at sea, to make absolutely sure that every choice is defensible if anyone later questions it. Legal officers and intelligence staff fold into this process as naturally as the navigators. They advise on what constitutes a safe maneuver, what crosses into interference, and where the destroyer has complete freedom of movement. That guidance shapes every heading change the officers on the deck approve, because in operations like this, documentation matters almost as much as positioning. Even the simplest actions are logged with care. A 15-degree course change noted at the exact minute and second. A reduction in speed to maintain spacing. A call to the helicopter detachment, confirming readiness. Those details may seem small in real time, but if anything ever goes wrong, an unexpected turn by the tanker, a miscommunication, a mechanical fault, every knot of speed and every degree of motion will be studied afterward. The crew knows that, and it shows in the precision of their work. Bridge-to-bridge calls are professional, even when the underlying message is direct. In this instance, we see you, we know who owns you, and we know who you are supplying, and we will be here again tomorrow. Meanwhile, Seahorse is not a ghost ship. Its crew still has to stand watch, tend the engines, and manage the cargo, all while fully aware that a highly capable U.S. destroyer is monitoring their movements from over the horizon. But you have to understand, for the U.S. Navy, this episode is a preview, not an outlier. Great power competition now lives in these gray areas. Shadow fleets, sanctions, proxy support, plausible deniability. You do not always get clean wins or clear failures. You get patterns, experiments, and messages. Seahorse was one such message, written in AIS tracks instead of press releases. A single destroyer maneuvering in open water. Just presence, pressure, and a reminder that sometimes the most effective move a warship can make is to be exactly where the other side does not want it to be. If you were riding the con on Stockdale, how far would you have taken it? Would you have kept shadowing even after a third U-turn? Or let the tanker in once the intelligence picture was complete? Tell us how you would handle that balance between law, deterrence, and escalation, and we will see you in the comments.